Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Forum. Come on in and grab your seat. Grab those coffees and head your way into the sanctuary. While we're waiting for our speaker to show, I know she's here. She's probably just getting some coffee as well. I'll just get some announcements out of the way. My name is Rob. I think you all know me. And I work with the Forum. Do you all know how to contact me? If you have any suggestions for me or ideas for improvement, give me a shout. I would love to hear your input. The next couple of weeks is part of our 150th History Series. I'm really excited about this, and I'm sure you will be too. We'll have Jim White moderating a panel with Chris Steenbergen. There's Chris right there coming in now, along with Jim Mattson and others. It'll be a 2-week series. So that's next week, the 20th and the 27th. You won't want to miss that as part of the history series. And then also I want to give a shout out to some of you remember seeing Rob Rogers last year speak here in the sanctuary. And he did a series on the 7 mountains. He is going to be speaking after this hour down at the Unitarian Church, the All Souls, around 12:15. So it'll be tight, but I plan to make it as well. He's going to be speaking on Christian nationalism down there. So let's talk about today. We have Minette Church. And I saw her walk in. There she is. We're getting her all mic'd up and ready. Thanks to Minette for reading the land acknowledgement this morning. Her topic this morning is called Indigenous Mapping Projects and History. Whose land are we on? As you know, Minette Church has been a member of FCC for 15 plus years. She's currently on church council as well. And she focuses on, she's a professor of anthropology at UCCS, where she focuses on the archaeology of parenting and childhood, landscape archaeology, border regions, and colonial, post-colonial transnational identities. So, I think she might be ready to go. Let's welcome Minette Church.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes. Great. I wanted to start by, we didn't acknowledge during the service that Sky Forster is really the person who got this ball rolling with composing the first drafts of a land acknowledgement statement. And so we were remiss not to mention him, but I want to mention him here. Sky, if you're out there, thank you if you're out there watching. So I wanted to begin with that. I consider the statement that we kind of jointly came up with as a living document, as Leanne said, and also sort of a statement of allyship. I'm getting up here to talk about the Forum, about the land acknowledgement. I do not make any claims to be speaking for Indigenous people. Historically, anthropologists have not been Indigenous people's favorite people, particularly archaeologists have not been always Indigenous people's favorite scholars. So if any of you have read a book by Vine Deloria, who is up in Boulder, yes, and he wrote a book called, in the late, I think it came out maybe in '69, and it's called Custer Died for Your Sins. And there's a whole chapter about anthropologists, and he's hilarious. But it is sharply worded and funny. So I actually recommend reading it. But anthropology has a history rooted in the colonialism that resulted in, our situation on the land where we are. And so our anthropology department has, let's see, is this the clicker? Okay, has come up with this land acknowledgement statement. We want to acknowledge that we live, work, learn, and grow on the traditional land of the Ute, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Jicarilla, Apache, Pawnee, Kiowa, Osage, Comanche, and Lakota. We want to honor with gratitude the land itself, the intellectual contributions, and the people who have stewarded these throughout the generations. We commit to the process of learning how to be better stewards of the land and of its heritage. As an archaeologist, when we come across human remains, there are actually, within the state of Colorado, 48 different tribes that we need to contact. And, you know, not all of them were in all parts of the state historically, but we have to contact a lot of people. And back several years ago when I was president of the Colorado Council of Professional Archaeologists, 20 years ago almost now, one of the things that the History Colorado got a grant to bring the tribal representatives of all those groups to Colorado so that they could have a conversation. We were allowed to be there, but we had to sit in the back of the room, and we weren't allowed to participate unless we were asked. And basically, the tribal representatives had funding to come and to gather and to decide how human remains were to be repatriated, given the number of groups that had a stake and had a historical presence in the state. And the agreement that everybody kind of finally agreed on was that the Ute were the people with the longest record. If you read or listen to Ute oral tradition of all the different Ute bands that are around today, they have always been here. That is the core of the story. They have always been here. And so they were the ones who had their core of their homeland was in Colorado. And the Hickory Apache also have very close ties. So all the groups and the Pawnee have ties to certain sites at certain periods of time. So it was very complicated, but there was broad agreement, and I'll just say that it made archaeologists' lives a lot easier in the sense that there weren't competing demands on what we were to do as a next step when we came across human remains. So, let's see. Here we go. I don't know if any of you have had a chance to go to the Ute Museum, the Ute History Museum. So History Colorado and the Ute have put together there's one in Montrose, that's where this is from, and there's one in Denver. And I highly recommend it. They're really good museums. And so this one has, in part of the exhibits, the maps of Ute territory. And so that one on the upper left is sort of the earliest original homelands, hunting grounds, trading networks of the Ute. And you can see in that dark area, the Uncompadre Ute, which is the bands that were in this area, were in sort of the bottom right of that darker area on the top left picture there. That is from 1849. 1873, the Ute have been confined to reservations in that area. And the upper left in Utah there, that reservation was established by Abraham Lincoln in the 1860s. And then 1880, there's even further restriction of the Ute groups. And between 1881 and 1882, the Southern Ute and the Ute Mountain Ute end up in that southwest corner of the state. So here's another map from the National Park Service that gives you a sense of which groups were in which areas, the sort of broader hunting areas, and then the wintering and other areas in the middle there, including the Uncompadre. Now, the Ute weren't really organized socially as a tribe. They weren't hierarchical and centralized in that way. It was really more a whole bunch of bands who would come together at various times and move apart at various times. So here's where we end up now, the Ute Indian tribe and the Uinta and the Ouray Ute. So the Uinta and the Ouray are up there in Utah, and then there's the Southern Ute Reservation and the Ute Mountain Ute Reservations down in the southwest there. Alden Naranjo, who has since passed, was a Ute elder that actually we did a lot of consultation with, very, very wise man. And so there's a quote on the wall at the museum: "We lost Colorado in less than 40 years." So when we think about the fact that this church, the congregation, was established 10 years after Sand Creek, it starts to sort of kind of put a timeline in our heads, and I think this does the same thing. Okay, so there's several indigenous mapping projects. The two biggest ones seem to come from Canadian First Nation people, but they cover all of North America, as you can see. And so this one is a tribal nations map. I'll show you a little bit more of a close-up of that here, which shows Colorado and New Mexico with all the Pueblo nations. And they use the indigenous names for the groups, not the English, but in lighter print, they have the Ute, the Arapaho, the Pawnee, and some of the groups that we've been talking about today, the Cheyenne. So to give you a sense of that. So that particular map here, I'll face you instead of craning my neck. He says, this is the gentleman who's put this together. As a young kid, I always sought knowledge about Native history and cultures and went to powwows and, went through the bins and didn't, found maps, but nothing that was, they all had flaws, they all had problems. So he said, it's time to make a real map of Native America as we see it. And so over the next 14 years, he came up with this map. It's available online. He does charge for it because there's ongoing research happening. Thousands of hours pouring through books, library archives, making phone calls, traveling to remote reservations in the spirit of creating the most thorough map of Native America in existence, and, collecting the oral histories of territories as well. There's another article that some of this comes from my introductory lecture to Archaeology of Native North America. So there's a document that I have them read. There's a great online magazine called Sapiens, which is an anthropology magazine that comes out of the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. So if you're ever interested in all things kind of archaeological, anthropological, ethnographic, that is a nice place to go. And this particular article is about the Zuni mapping project. So again, the Zuni decided it was time to create their own kind of cartography. So if you looked at that other map I just showed you, it has all of the original names from the indigenous words for indigenous tribes, but it's still very much, a projection, a map projection that is very Western and arguably US-centric. It makes the United States look bigger, and it centers it on the map, and it's, north is facing up, which if it was a medieval map, it would be east, but for us now it's north. So it's still a cartography in terms of the organization of the map that is still very Western, European kind of intellectual tradition of mapping. So Jim Elote, the director, and I'm Ashiwi Atwan, that's the best I can do. I do not know that that's right. Museum and Heritage Center at Zuni Pueblo. And he talks about how there's large books. I mean, if you talk to geographers, the power of maps, they're political statements. Often maps are political statements. And while modern American maps will get them from place to place, like Google will get you to place, they fail to record and present the landscape in a meaningful way from the perspective of a culturally literate Zuni person. So put another way, modern maps don't record places important to Zuni history, cosmology, ecology, and religion. So, working with Steve Nash, who's the author of this particular article, they were recording rock art projects. And so rock art is one of the ways that Indigenous people mark the landscape for all kinds of reasons, some of them religious and spiritual, some of them guideposts, some of them territorial marking. We find a lot of rock art, particularly in mountain passes, which kind of makes sense if you think about it. So they went along, and Ronnie Caccini created this map. And this map is in 3 registers, the bottom third, the middle third, a little more than a third, and the top. And the top is the sun, the moon, the stars, and a supernova that occurred in the 10,000s. I think it's 1054 or 1056. Anyway, it is a supernova that is depicted on rock art all over the Southwest, which, you know, rock art is notoriously hard to date, and so that's always a really handy thing. When we find a rock art that has that supernova, we're like, okay, that's when that was, at least that piece of that rock art was carved. The bottom is a harvest dance under the rainbow figure, and there's Eagle Mountain up at the top, which is a sacred peak. And then in the middle register is essentially the archaeological sites that Nash and the Zuni went and recorded and talked about oral history. And these are very important places in Zuni history. So there's a cave site that's kind of down over to the left. There's a Pueblo site down on the right. There's rock art panels around there. And you can see there's no north arrow. It's not cartography in the way we generally think about cartography, but for a Zuni person, like a culturally literate Zuni person looking at this map would know exactly what they were looking at. Another project is Severin Fowles, who's an archaeologist, and Jimmy Arterberry, who's a Comanche tribal elder, are looking at rock art panels in the northern Rio Grande. And so this is from Archaeology Magazine from 2020. There's a natural hole in the rock that they think might have been a spring. And they're raiding horses. These actually are probably feral horses. They're not raiding horses and stealing them from another group, but those are horses. And you can see the horseshoe marks around the spring, in the mud around the spring. And so that's the Vista Verde site. Here's another one that I think is really interesting. This is about a battle. So the Ute and the Comanche were allied for a long time, and then that alliance broke apart in the 18th century, and there were a lot of battles in that northern Rio Grande Gorge area, and so this may depict one of those. So those are teepees. There are mounted horse people, and that one on the lower left, there's lines connecting him to another person at the teepee, and Jimmy Arterberry and others thought that might be counting coup. So rather than killing somebody in a battle, especially in this earlier period, you would touch them with a coup stick, and that this was how you demonstrated your valor in warfare. And then there's also these sort of, let's see, up here, there's sort of the stand with a shield on it, and feathers is what they think that this here And this here depicts these family shields that were often outside of teepees that would have denoted whose teepee it was. So this is a form of mapping on the landscape too, and marking territory and telling history and telling storytelling. Maps tell stories. I mean, our modern maps tell stories, and these tell stories as well. Prayer trees. This is kind of a contentious topic. I know that when we go out to La Forêt, there's that prayer tree map where we can go around. The county and the city foresters have told Anna Cordova and others, archaeologists as well. Anna was the city archaeologist for Colorado Springs. She now is a manager for Garden of the Gods Park. She is an Indigenous person. And he said, this is genetic. These bent trees, this is a genetic pattern. It is not something that the Ute did. There are bent trees down in Oklahoma and that area that apparently the Comanche did practice this sort of training, bonsai training of trees in certain directions sometimes, but none of the groups in Colorado claim to have done this. And in fact, the person who has been talking about this has had exchanges with the Ute elders. They've sort of given him and a colleague of his a cease and desist. Please stop generating this. He has, in response, said, I am doing something, I'm telling a history that the Ute themselves have forgotten about. And you can imagine how that goes over with the Ute people. And so the Colorado Council of Professional Archaeologists came out with an official statement regarding bent tree, which I'm not going to read, don't worry. And the Ute, the Southern Ute and the Ute Mountain Ute themselves have also come out with a statement, and this is just the first page of it. But this is the official position of the Southern Ute Indian Tribe and the Ute Mountain Ute Indian Tribe of the Ute Nation regarding bent trees, which they put in quotation marks, within the heartland of Aboriginal territory and ancestral hunting grounds in the state of Colorado. While other tribes may have conducted these types of practices, the practice of bending trees is not a part of the customary cultural traditions of Ute people, past or present, who comprise the Southern Ute and Ute Mountain Ute Indian tribes. So then they go through all of the different assertions about prayer trees, spirit trees, trail marker trees. Some individuals claiming to possess Ute cultural knowledge have incorrectly asserted that Ute people purposely bent trees for cultural purposes. According to tribal elders, tribal historians, spiritual leaders, and traditional practitioners from the Southern Ute and the Ute Mountain Indian tribes agree this is not a known Ute practice within our oral tradition, nor is it practiced today. So pretty clear. And there was a lot of back and forth before they just decided we have to put out a statement. Another example of the Ute being very proactive about how their story gets told in this state and who gets to tell their story in this state is, and if you talk to Leah Witherow about this over at the Pioneers Museum, a lot of teachers, at least up until recently, of 4th and 5th grade Colorado, where you do the Colorado history curriculum, they would take students to the Manitou cliff dwellings as part of the unit for that. This also did not make the Ute very happy because those cliff dwellings were brought in brick by brick. It doesn't make actually many of the Pueblo groups very happy either. It was brought in brick by brick at the turn of the century from a site which I actually got to visit a couple years ago in, I forget whether it's southwestern Colorado or just over the border into Utah, I think. But basically there's a ranch and there's like a 1960s ranch house built on it now on the site where that was. And the people who run the site are not particularly transparent. In fact, there seems, when you look at their materials, they're being kind of deliberately opaque about the origins, because indigenous people never built cliff dwellings in Colorado Springs or Manitou Springs. That didn't happen. I think it was, marketing. It was easy to bring school groups there, and so Leah said that part of the work that she's been doing and Pioneers Museum has been doing is trying to do they had the Crossroads exhibit, which talks about the indigenous people and the Spanish-speaking peoples who were actually in this area for longer times. And the Ute, again, finally getting sort of to a certain point, said, we're going to do something proactive. And so there is, and I've shared it with Sarah Lund, a Ute curriculum, a Ute school curriculum for 4th, 5th graders, but actually they've put together lesson plans that are for older students as well, that are Ute history, according to the Ute. And so more and more schools are using those. But, a lot of our teachers are kind of sadly underpaid and overworked, and so it takes time to like shift your whole lesson plan for the history of Colorado for your year. So, but the Ute have tried to make this as easy as possible by putting lesson plans and the whole project online. It's free and accessible and open to the public. So that exists. So there's sort of this movement to resist the stories that are told about them with stories that are told by them. I could go over, maybe I shouldn't, but a little bit of the origins of the colonialist project. And some of these are discovery and conquest of the province of Peru, and the navigation of the South Sea along that coast, and the rich mines of Potosi. So we talked in the acknowledgement statement about for commercial purposes. Mining was one of them. This is from 1581 and refers to South America. Here's Sir Francis, I kind of like this one. Sir Francis Drake revived, calling upon this dull or effeminate age to follow his noble steps for gold and silver. So anybody who thinks that the English were somehow better than the Spanish, sort of that black legend in terms of colonial projects, the English were just as motivated by gold and silver as the Spanish or any other Europeans were. When they encountered plants, animals, and people that they had never seen before, they were trying to fit them into a worldview that was a very hierarchical, God created the plants of the earth, the fishes of the sea, and it was a very static worldview. In the 1500s, in most of Europe, was not a very socially mobile kind of place. You were born into an estate, and you kind of stayed there for the most part. And so if God created all the world at the same time 6,000 years ago, according to Archbishop Usher, then, and now they're all of a sudden finding all these other things. They've got to fit it into their system. So and there was a lot of the kind of origins of what we would call kind of natural sciences happening, and so people would bring back these things and they put them in botanical museums, royal botanical museums, royal zoological museums. This is the origin of our modern botanical gardens and zoos. And wealthy individuals who were doing this kind of research would create these museums, this one in Germany from 1655. Thomas Jefferson famously had a kind of museum like this. John Adams did, there's a couple of our founding fathers. And they would just collect this stuff and then put it in categories. And so here, oftentimes, is how people viewed the world. This is called the Great Chain of Being. You have God at the top, the cherubim, the seraphim, humans, the birds of the air, the fishes of the sea. I think there's just some mammals going on down there, some trees, plants, and then you've got Satan and the fallen at the bottom of it. And so many of them were trying to put things into at the time, Catholic hierarchy. This idea, Great Chain of Being, I think was Aristotle, but it had been sort of adopted by the Catholic Church. And so you get these paintings that I think are really interesting. This one from 1501 or 1502, and they're trying to fit what they're learning about indigenous people into the stories they already have been told in the Bible. So in this one, in Melchior is a indigenous person from Brazil. They've replaced this North African individual with an individual from Brazil. So you get these really interesting paintings at the time that are trying to sort of fit all this new information coming from North and South America and other places into the existing worldview. When you get to the 19th century, this is a poem by John Greenleaf Whittier. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but there's a couple of stanzas that jump out to me. Behind the scared squaw's birch canoe, the steamer smokes and raves, and city lots are staked for sale above old Indian graves, is one of them. And the other one is, I hear the tread of pioneers of nations yet to be, the first low wash of waves that soon shall roll a human sea. So when you get to the mid-19th century, or the late 19th century, well, mid-1849, this was published in a newspaper in Louisiana. This is very much the idea, the justification. There's a lot of religious language woven into these statements. Manifest destiny is in itself actually a kind of a Protestant Christian conception at that time. It is our manifest destiny given to us by God to spread and prosper in this landscape, and it's part of how people viewed the Protestant work ethic. They looked at land ownership as being part of that. You made improvements on the land, and that was part of the Protestant work ethic. And what they saw, when they saw people who were mobile people, who were hunters and gatherers and did not live on the land and didn't build buildings that they recognized as permanent structures, they did not consider them to be making improvements as God directed. And therefore, that was the justification for them to go in and build improvements. Here's a painting, American Progress by George Crowfoot, 1873, and it really reminds me of that poem, right? So here's this giant woman who's having a little bit of a wardrobe malfunction, who's coming across with telegraph wire, right? She's stringing telegraph wire across the plains. She's carrying, I believe it's, you would think maybe a Bible, but I think it's a school primer. So she's here to bring education and civilization. You know, there's a lot of depicting concepts as classically garbed women, you know, Columbia, justice, the scales of justice. So this is progress. And, you know, you see the Missouri and the Mississippi in the east, and that's very well lit. That's the enlightened east, and the dark, unenlightened west. And there are stagecoaches and trains, and then they're fleeing Native Americans, right, who are fleeing to the darker half of the painting. There's a lot of This is from a book plate, Beyond the Mississippi. And again, you have these Native Americans who are kind of hunched and fleeing and about to be hit by a train. And so there's a little bit of, it's already a little bit of nostalgia. And there's this sense of the noble savages, the innocents, but you can't hold back progress. Progress is coming. I like this one, the Madonna of the Prairie. So this lasts into the 20th century, this sort of idea of this religious kind of reasoning behind moving west, and this Gibson girl with the wagon is a little anachronistic, but yes, so this Madonna of the Prairie who's bringing, it's when men came out as trappers and married indigenous women, that wasn't civilizing the prairie. It wasn't really civilizing until the women came out. It was kind of the idea. Here's a painting by George Catlin about some of the changes that are happening. This is among the Mandan village people along the Missouri. And a lot of this dichotomy between the noble savage and the savage savage is built into our National Mall. It's built into the sculptures in Washington, D.C. So you've got this frieze, and you look at certain details of it, and you've got this, it's almost like the thinker, but clearly an indigenous person. I think supposed to be maybe Lenape from the East Coast, but wearing sort of a plains headdress, so there's a lot of mixing up of that kind of thing. So that's a very noble image. This is the more savage image where, protecting his wife and baby from a savage, quote unquote. And so these are all in the same area, right? All these depictions are all in our place of government, in our national mall. This one, I think that's William Penn. He's holding a treaty from 1682, and then a less peaceful image to the right. So, the going back to that, the noble savages are the ones who sign treaties with you and agree to do what you want. The savage savages are the ones who are defending their land. Another piece of the justification for coming west and taking over land was what we call the mound builder myth. Have any of you heard of the mound builder myth? Is that something anybody's? Okay, so if you've traveled I-70 across the country, in East St. Louis, there's a sign that says Cahokia. It's a national park, Cahokia Mound Site. And it is the main mound at Cahokia is the largest earthen structure in North America. And, but there are mounds all over the Great Plains and the prairie into the east and into the southeast. So Georgia, all along the river systems. And starting in the late archaic period, 6,000 years ago, all the way to the point where the French and Spanish, people like not Coronado, but De Soto, and French traders came across these people. And so when the Spanish came through, there was lots of battles, there was disease, so that by the time the French came through, the same thing. And then there was a break before the British came, and they didn't do a lot of reading of the journals of the original expeditions, and so they're like, look, there are these mounds, they're abandoned. The modern Native Americans that are living here could not have built these mounds because, look, they're living in scattered farms, and hunting and gathering and mobile groups, so they did not credit that the people who they were encountering, like the Creek and the Cherokee and Choctaw and those groups might actually, and the Osage, might have actually built those mounds. And so they came up with a whole lot of alternative explanations. So it was the Celts that came and built the mounds. It was, maybe the Aztec came and built the mounds. But there was, Europeans, a lot of, stories about Europeans, maybe Vikings came and built the mounds. There's still, some of those stories are still out there. And so this is what we call the mound builder myth. In his notes on the state of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson, who was trying to argue with the French that America was better than France, more or less, that's a simplification, but he excavated one of these mounds. This is a painting, this is not his excavation, but one of the things he did was excavate a mound, did an early excavation and found, or he didn't, his enslaved labor did the actual excavation, and he found that the kinds of pottery that people were using around that area right now, or at that time in the 18th century, was the same kind of pottery that was buried at the top of the mounds. And then stylistically, there was slow change in the pottery going down through time in the mound. So he did one of the earliest good stratigraphic excavations, and found proof that nobody really listened to, that the indigenous people in Virginia had built and occupied these mounds. Another famous one, has anybody been to Serpent Mound in Ohio? This is in southern Ohio. Definitely worth a visit. There are effigy mounds like this one that are shaped like animals. There are other mounds that were occupied and had housing on top of them. Squire and Davis went through in the 1848, so around the time as that Hear the Tread of Pioneers poem was coming out, they went and they were mapping all of these sites. We still use these maps because many of them have been plowed under or are under St. Louis or are otherwise gone. So we still use, they did very good survey maps working for the Smithsonian Institution. And these go all the way up to Wisconsin and all the way to Georgia and all the way to Louisiana and into Oklahoma. I mean, they probably weren't all the same groups of people, but this mound building tradition is all around that area. And Cyrus Thomas, in the annual report for the Bureau of Ethnology in 1890, he started out thinking, oh, surely somebody else built these. But as he did the research, or as he had other people go do the research, he came to the conclusion, again, as Thomas Jefferson had, a century earlier, yes, indigenous people built these mounds. But you'd be surprised how many people still think that, and is it really that different than saying aliens built the pyramids? It's really not. And it's fundamentally the issue that indigenous people have and many anthropologists have is that there's a big seed of racism in the idea that you are saying that the indigenous people not only didn't build them but weren't capable, that they had to have extraterrestrial help to build these mounds, that you can only build an effigy mound if you can somehow be in the air looking down on it. We know that that's not true. So over and over, scholars are like, well, indigenous people are like, no, we built them. And then scholars are like, look, we're using scientific excavation, and yes, indigenous people built them. But we still have Ancient Aliens as one of the most popular History Channel shows on TV. And we have conflicts like this one. So this is a screen capture, and that was a group, what were they called? The Pass the Salt Ministry, who, where am I? Okay, I should quit. But the Pass the Salt are here having a conflict with indigenous people who This is part of their Indigenous history, and they are saying, this has nothing to do with the Indians. This is a place of darkness. There's evil emanating out of it. It's a snake. Snakes have certain kinds of connotations in Christian traditions. And so they published this thing headlined, "Pagans Try to Prevent Prayer." But, so there's still these conflicts going on, right? There's still these conflicts going on. So I will finish here with some modern native art. I really like mohawks and beehives. That's a great name. But a lot of Indigenous art, the present, is all about how we're still here. And we need to be seen. So this is a Dene artist that just because we drive a car, we are still Indigenous. Just because we dress, there's this idea that wants to lock people in time into a past rather than the present. And so here we go. How do I hit play? I guess I do that here. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Smoke Signals, but I'm just going to stop with this short clip because this guy here is a storyteller. Can we hear it? No. What's up with sound?
There's a good chance it's not going to have any audio from up there, so I can pull it up from back here.
Okay. Has anybody seen this movie? A couple people? Yeah. So these two women drive around the reservation in this car that will only drive backwards. So they're constantly they're like, drinking Coke because they don't drink anymore, but they're driving around like this through the whole movie. That's all right. If it's too late, if we want to go to questions instead of watching the video, what do you think, Leanne? Should we? Because it's already noon. Okay.
Hey, Victor, sorry to hear about your dad. You need a ride?
Yeah.
Hey, Thomas. Need a ride?
You bet.
What are you gonna trade for it? We're Indians, remember? We barter.
A story?
Good.
Sorry. Sorry.
Hey, Victor, sorry to hear about your dad. You need a ride?
Yeah.
Hey, Thomas. Need a ride?
You bet.
What are you gonna trade for it? We're Indians, remember? We barter.
A story?
Good. Better be good.
During the 60s, Arnold Joseph was the perfect hippie because all the hippies were trying to be Indians anyway. But because of that, he was always wondering how anybody would know when an Indian was trying to make a social statement. But there's proof, Back during the Vietnam War, he was demonstrating against it, and there was this photographer there. He took a picture of Arnold that day, and it made it onto the wire services and was reprinted in newspapers throughout the country. It even made it to the cover of Time magazine. In that photograph, Arnold is wearing bell-bottoms and a flowered shirt, his hair in braids with red peace symbols splashed across his face like war paint. He holds a rifle above his head, captured in that moment just before he proceeded to beat the shit out of the National Guard private lying on the ground beneath him. Another demonstrator holds a sign just barely visible over his left shoulder. It reads, "Make love, not war."
Jeez, did your dad really do that?
Thomas, you're so full of shit.
Oh, then what happened?
Arnold got arrested, you know, but he got lucky. At first, they charged him with attempted murder, but then they plea bargained that down to assault with a deadly weapon, and then they plea bargained that down to being an Indian in the 20th century. Then he got 2 years in Walla Walla.
So what do you think?
Well, I think it's a fine example of the oral tradition.
But they're floating just above the rain. We are floating.
So then they drive away backwards. But you know, they're playing with of authenticity and what, you know, the crime of being an Indian in the 20th century. And I just think that's a telling way to kind of wind this up. So, any questions?
Any questions for Minette? Here we go then.
Hey, this was great. I have a question about language. Ute
There you are.
and Nunzi, you know, there's the name Ute and then Nunzi or
Yeah.
Navajo and Diné. Could you explain that to me, like you know, how these are different and where they each came from?
Okay, so I can try. It's we have a linguistic anthropologist I could bring in to talk more about that, but they're different language families. Yeah, like Ute and Comanche come from a larger language family, Uto-Aztecan, and whereas the Apache and the Navajo come from Athapascan language-speaking larger group family, you know, which is interesting because they're down here in the Southwest, and the rest of the Athabascan speakers are all in the Canadian Shield, you know, up north. But yeah, so there's, and then if you saw that the first map, all the Pueblo groups, many of them speak mutually understandable languages. You know, they different languages for each Pueblo. Yeah. So.
Here's a question.
Yeah, mine is actually related to that because when you talked about, it really intrigued me early on when you talked about the Utes being actually a bunch of bands would be a better way to understand them. And I thought, well, what really makes a Ute, you know?
Right.
And so I wondered, was it the language that really would, and then I wondered, well, if that's part of it or an important part of it, like, can you trace your DNA to a tribe, and you know how language kind of does keep us from, you know, mixing, and so.
That's a lot of big questions. There's a lot of whether you can trace your genetics is a very contentious thing. Most of tribal identity and legal belonging to the political entity that is a tribe, which has a government-to-government relationship with ours, is every tribe has a different standard. Every tribe has, and some of them have literally a blood quotient, you know, and use genetics. But others, and to different degrees, if you're born and raised in that culture, you know, in terms of identity. So yeah, I remember when Elizabeth Warren like said, well, I did my 23andMe and it says this, and it was a story that her grandmother and great-grandmother had told her, and that's really common. But it creates issues. I mean, for example, if you have a kid who wants to go to college, and they say, look, 23andMe, I'm Cherokee, and then they're applying for scholarships that honestly may be more required, you know, that there are people in much worse situations who are Cherokee, who were born and raised within the cultural tradition of being Cherokee, who could use that money. You know, so it becomes, it's a very contentious thing. But I do think it's language and stories and heritage in the sense of inherited sense of tribal identity, yeah, different groups have different rules about that, for sure.
Any other questions? Well, thank you so much, Minette, for bringing this topic to us on a very important day for the life of our church. And don't forget, next week, it's that two-parter with Jim White and Chris, and Jim Madsen is in here too, I think. So that the first week is entitled FCC in Cultural Context. You won't want to miss that. And the following week, 150 Years of Pastors. And that you really don't want to miss. I think that's going to be really special. So we'll see you next week.
Yeah. Good. I'm glad.